Empires did not ignore Africa, they depended on it. That is the part ancient history too often hides. Africa was not just sitting beside the ancient world, watching bigger powers make history. Africa was one of the reasons those powers could become big in the first place. It fed empires, it financed kingdoms, it connected oceans. It supplied gold, soldiers, ports, and trade corridors that other civilizations could not afford to lose. And once you see that clearly, the map changes. Rome looks different, Egypt looks different, the Red Sea looks different, even the Mediterranean looks different, because the hidden reason Africa mattered so much to the ancient world is simple. It controlled things the ancient world desperately needed. Things that are not optional, they are very important. They are things like food, gold, movement, power, and many other things, and that changes everything. Start with North Africa. People talk about Rome like it was self-sustaining, like the empire just rose out of pure discipline and military genius. But empires do not run on confidence. They run on supply. They run on grain. They run on ships. They run on strategic coastlines. After Rome took Egypt, massive quantities of Egyptian grain were shipped down the Nile into Alexandria and then exported to Rome. That means one of the greatest empires in history was being fed in part by Africa. Pause there. An empire that cannot eat does not stay an empire for long. So when we talk about Africa's importance, we are not talking about decoration around the edges of civilization. We are talking about the survival system, and Egypt was only one part of that story. Farther west, Carthage rose on the North African coast and became something Rome could not casually dismiss. It was built in a position that allowed it to influence and control ships moving between Sicily and the North African coast across the Mediterranean. Britannica describes it as a thriving port and trading center that became a major Mediterranean power and a rival to Rome. That is not a side character, that is a power center. Carthage mattered because Africa was not just a place of resources, it was also a place of roots. Whoever could command those maritime routes could shape commerce, war, and diplomacy across the Mediterranean. That is why Carthage became so dangerous. It was not simply wealthy, it was positioned, and position in ancient history is everything. Now shift south. Because if North Africa mattered for shipping food, the Nile Valley mattered for something even more explosive. Kush sat across trade routes linking Egypt to the Red Sea and linking the Nile to lands farther south and west. Britannica notes that this position brought Kush considerable wealth, while its gold and emerald mines produced bullion and jewels for Egypt. It also notes that Nubians were highly valued as soldiers. Think about the combination of gold and soldiers, money and force. That is the kind of combination that makes states matter whether outsiders like it or not. And this is where the story gets uncomfortable for the old version of history many people inherited. Because ancient Africa was not important only because outsiders came looking for things. Ancient African kingdoms were important because they understood how to turn geography into leverage. Kush did not just sit on wealth, it sat on the roots wealth had to move through. That is a different kind of power. And sometimes it became so strong that Kush did not merely trade with Egypt. It ruled Egypt. Britannica notes that under Pe in the 8th century BCE, Kushite rule extended through Egypt all the way to the Mediterranean. Before I proceed, let me brief you who Pe was, also known as Payenki, who was a Kushite king from Napata, located in modern-day Sudan. He ruled in the 8th century BCE and became one of the most important rulers of ancient Africa because he extended Kushite power into Egypt. He is best known for conquering much of Egypt from the south and helping establish the 25th dynasty of Egypt, also called the Kushite dynasty, or sometimes the Nubian dynasty. This dynasty united Kush/Nubia and Egypt under his rulers from the African kingdom of Kush. In simple terms, Pe was a Kushite pharaoh king who ruled from Sudan and brought Egypt under Kushite influence, making him a central figure in ancient African history. That means an African kingdom from the south was not merely connected to the ancient world. It was directly shaping one of its most famous civilizations. Now stop and let that settle, because this is where the script most people were taught starts falling apart. Africa was not outside the ancient world. Africa was inside its bloodstream, and then the story moves east. Because if Kush helps explain Africa's importance along the Nile, Aksum explains Africa's importance to the Red Sea and beyond. Aksum was not just another kingdom. Britannica says it played a key role in linking African, Mediterranean, and Asian trade networks, and at its height, it dominated the Red Sea coast. It became the greatest market of northeastern Africa, with merchants trading as far as Alexandria and beyond the Nile. UNESCO goes even further, describing Aksum as the most powerful state between the Eastern Roman Empire and Persia. That is a stunning sentence. The most powerful things in state between Rome and Persia. Not in Europe, not in Western Asia, but are in Africa. And suddenly, the entire old image of Africa as distant and disconnected starts to look absurd. Because Aksum mattered for the same reason great powers always matter. It sat where worlds met. African goods could move outward. Mediterranean demand could move inward. Asian connections could move across the sea. And whoever controlled that corridor did not just profit. They shaped the terms of exchange itself. That is why Africa mattered so much to the ancient world. It was not merely a landmass full of things. It was a hinge, a connector, and a pressure point that all centralized. And once you understand that, even basic ancient history starts reading differently. Rome was not only looking north and east, it was tied to African grain. It was challenged by African powers. It was forced to reckon with African coastlines and African states. Egypt was not only a miracle of river civilization. It was bound to Nubia and Kush, drawing wealth from African mines, trade routes, and military manpower. The Red Sea was not just a body of water beside Africa. It was one of the great arteries of exchange, and African kingdoms like Aksum were standing right on it, directing the flow. And maybe that is the hidden reason this story hits so hard once you finally hear it, because it forces a reversal. People are used to hearing how the ancient world influenced Africa. Much less often are they asked to see how Africa helped sustain the ancient world itself. That reversal matters. It matters because memory shapes value. If people grow up hearing that Africa was peripheral, they begin to assume that importance always came from somewhere else. But if Africa fed Rome, financed Egypt, challenged Mediterranean powers, and linked trade between major civilizations, then Africa was not peripheral at all. It was foundational. And foundational things are easy to overlook precisely because everything else is standing on them. That is what happened here. Food is not glamorous until it runs out. Trade routes are not glamorous until they close. Gold is not abstract when it is financing power. Strategic geography is not theoretical when empires start fighting over it. Africa mattered because it touched all of those things at once. And that is why the ancient world kept returning to it, fighting over it, trading through it, depending on it, and fearing the powers that rose from it. Not because Africa was mysterious, but because Africa was necessary, and that is the actual word for it. Necessary to Rome's grain supply, necessary to Mediterranean shipping, necessary to Egypt's wealth, necessary to Red Sea commerce, necessary to the movement of luxury goods, armies, and ideas across the ancient world. And once you see that, another truth becomes harder to ignore. Africa mattered not only for what it had, it mattered for what it could block. That is real power. A kingdom sitting on a major corridor is not just a supplier. It is a gatekeeper. A port can open routes or choke them. A coastline can welcome trade or threaten it. A river kingdom can enrich its neighbors or force them to negotiate. That is why states like Carthage, Kush, and Aksum were not small regional curiosities. They were strategic facts the ancient world had to live with. And this is exactly where the emotional weight of the story comes in. Because for a long time, Africa has been discussed as if its significance appeared only when outsiders arrived. But ancient history does not support that. The evidence points the other way. Africa was already significant because it held the food, roots, manpower, and wealth that made ancient systems work. Outside empires did not invent Africa's importance. They reacted to it. That is a very different story. And honestly, it is a much more interesting one, because it turns Africa from backdrop into engine, from scenery into structure, from edge into center. So the next time someone talks about the ancient world as if Africa was an afterthought, remember this. Rome ate African grain. Mediterranean power clashed with African ports. Egypt drew wealth from African mines and trade routes. The Red Sea world depended on African kingdoms that connected continents. That is not a footnote. That is a foundation. And the hidden reason Africa mattered so much to the ancient world was never really hidden at all. It was just too important to fit the smaller story people were told. Subscribe to Ancient Africa Explained for more videos like this. Turn on notification bell, and let me know the area you would like me to cover on my next video.